Our reading this morning is chapter 16 of the Gospel of Mark, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. As human beings, we love stories. We love stories so much that we write stories about stories. You can get a PhD in stories. You can make a whole career writing stories about stories. And in fact, there is a whole online subculture dedicated to writing stories about stories. I'm talking about that traditional Easter reference, of course, to fan fiction. Beginning in sci-fi communities in the 70s, fan fiction is simply the idea that when you get to the end of your favorite book or the end of your favorite trilogy or favorite series, you realize that there should be more of this story that you love so much, and so you write more. And you share it with other people who want to read those stories too. But it's funny, when you read fan fiction, you can sometimes tell the difference between people who are writing fan fiction, who are writing a story about the story, or writing a different story about the story, because the plot holes are interesting to them, or the character is interesting to them. They're trying to dig deeper or do something different. But sometimes you read fan fiction and you can tell that people are just trying to find a better resolution. They're trying to tie a neat little bow on the plot hole that they found, and they think that they know best how to solve the plot hole, unlike that stinking author. Right? The best stories about stories take a beloved text and put it in conversation with new and different ideas or realities or lived experiences. They take the spaces, the gaps, the holes, the unknown, and wonder what could be different if something were added or changed. And the concept, I think, of fan fiction and other sort of stories about stories, it's remained so popular over the years because human beings love to ask, what if? We love to wonder about what could be possible if something or someone were suddenly part of this ongoing story. We love to imagine what might be happening in the spaces between the little slides on the Viewmaster. And our ancient forebears were no different, though they did not have internet forums in which to do it. Right? The best storytellers in the ancient world knew that if they wanted their listeners to be compelled to action, they needed to leave some space in the story for the listeners to write themselves into it. And to me, this is one of the greatest gifts of the Gospel of Mark, and particularly its retelling of what happens in the days following Jesus' crucifixion and death. And this gospel is not meant to convey every detail of Jesus' life, like Mike mentioned. Right? In fact, Jesus sort of enters the story as a fully grown adult right at the beginning. The narratives about a miraculous birth, or John's narratives about who Jesus was in the context of the developing Christian theology, those come later. The earliest version of the teachings of Jesus that we have is this one, meant to be heard, often in a single sitting originally. Right, so if you imagine that a traveling storyteller or preacher comes to town and they tell the Gospel of Mark in its entirety, right, sort of a one-man show about the life of Jesus, if you will. And that the ending of that one-man show about the life of Jesus is not meant to have you walk away thinking, wow, that was really sound theology. Can't argue with that. That would not have been helpful, right? That the end of this story is meant to invite you into the story, to invite you to consider what the story means for you and how you will live in response to the story. But for many of you here today, this is not how the stories of Jesus' life and ministry and death were used in the faith communities that some of you grew up in. Or if you grew up in this community or in without one, or in a more progressive one, you maybe encountered this in your wider community, right? People, churches, pastors who treated these stories as fixed, eternal, unchanging, and unyielding. Right? That these stories were used to provoke shame, fear, and compliance with restrictive social norms. Not exactly an invitation to radical wonder at the conclusion of a one-man show about the life of a rabbi. It's the question that is asked in the song, have these stories ever been used as a sword against you or against those that you love? Have these stories ever been used to provoke harm or fear in your life? I would say that portraying the life and teachings of Jesus as supporting the agenda of socially conservative and restrictive norms is genuinely the worst fan fiction that we have. Because it is that. All of the ways that those teachings are used are stories, passed down through the generations, and that the level of certitude required to use them to divide and to harm like a sword is arrogant at best. Because this story can be used as a plowshare, too. It can open up something inside of us that allows for growth and for change. But as Unitarian Universalists, we don't believe that that opening, that change happens by magic or by mystical resurrection. It happens in our humanity. And throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is deeply engaged with his human community. He travels, he teaches, he meets people, he feeds them, the number one work of religious institutions. You do get very angry if there's no cookies at coffee hour. Right? And he tries to help his disciples and followers understand what's going on with this radical message of deep and profound love and a different world breaking through that Jesus is trying to share. But like any human community, Jesus' followers struggle. They struggle to fill in the gaps with the information that Jesus is sharing with them. Jesus tells them to keep his status as the Messiah a secret, which they broadly fail to do. Think about it, we're so bad. We're such leaky ships, us human beings. Someone says, this is the most important secret I've ever told anyone. And we immediately turn to our neighbor and go, "Oh my gosh, have you heard?" Jesus tried to tell them about the risks of being associated with a radical like him. And the followers left behind after his death struggled with how to tell that story. Right? And that passage that I read this morning, where it ends with the women who have come to anoint Jesus' body, which was a traditional sort of funeral practice of the time, the end of that gospel is that they run away because they are afraid. I would offer the contemporary translation, freaked out, right? Not afraid like terrified, but afraid like, what is happening? And that is the original ending of the gospel text, right? The sort of the oldest textual versions we have of this gospel end right there. And later versions of the text add stuff on. They try to put a neat little bow on it and say like, no, he definitely came back. It really happened for sure. Then they all met and talked 100%. No worries, no uncertainty here. I dare say those additions are fan fiction, trying to bring a clearer resolution than the original text offered. And for me, this original version of the text, where it ends with uncertainty, with being freaked out, with an open question about what's going to happen next, to me, that is a plowshare rather than a sword. When it's told and shared in open-hearted community, that is a plowshare story. If we are willing to explore the meaning today in ways that challenge us. And one of the other sort of hallmarks of the Gospel of Mark is that there are places in the story where this new world, this other world, this realm of God, as Jesus would have put it, keeps breaking through into the one occupied by Jesus and his followers. And whether you understand that literally or metaphorically, it's the idea that something different is trying to emerge into this messed up old world. It's the idea that things as they are right now, all of the injustice, all of the suffering, all of this, it could be different. And that different is constantly poking out, right? Like a box in your grocery bag poking through. And like a green shoot in spring coming up from that bed of dead leaves. But this breaking through, this other realm breaking through, is not neat or easily controllable or even easily fully understood. In chapter 12 of the Gospel of Mark, sort of right before we get into what's called the Passion story, right? The story of Jesus' arrest and torture and crucifixion and death, is that right before that, one of the stories that gets told right before that happens is the story of what's called the widow's mite. And where a poor widow gives her last 2 coins, sort of everything she has. And that story is often used to sort of browbeat people into giving more money to the church than they perhaps ought to. But that if you understand it as part of the metaphor, the metaphorical invitation, the widow is taking a risk by giving everything she has. And so instead of being about how much money you should or should not give to the church, the widow's mite is about how risky it is to be part of when something different breaks through all of the oppression and suffering in this life. And as Unitarian Universalists, this was the foundational story for our religious forebears. This story of Jesus and his life and his ministry and his death. But it is not the only story that is a plowshare for us today as Unitarian Universalists. There are many stories from other religious traditions, from our own lives, from literature, from poetry, from music, that are the stories that create space for something possible within us. What has remained the same for us as our forebears, though, is that we are seeking stories that invite us into that different world that is breaking through into this one. Like a seed pushing through the earth, eased by the groundbreaking of a plow. These stories create spaces into which something different, something new, can grow. May we find these plowshare stories for ourselves, for each other, and for our world. May it be so. Amen.